The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the dirt road into a muddy river that reflected the dim glow of the old bus stop's flickering light. Sarah Martinez pulled her worn leather jacket tighter around her shoulders as she hurried past her, combat boots splashing through puddles that seemed to mirror the gray November sky above. The cold Montana wind cut through her like a blade, carrying with it the scent of pine and the bitter promise of winter. She almost missed him. A small whimper, barely audible above the storm, made her pause mid-step. There, huddled beneath the rusted bus stop bench, was a ball of wet fur, trembling against the metal supports. Sarah's military-trained eyes immediately assessed the situation. German Shepherd, puppy, maybe 8 weeks old, soaked to the bone, and clearly abandoned. No collar, no tags, no sign of an owner anywhere in sight. Moved. On Martinez, she muttered to herself, the same voice that had kept her alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan. Not your problem. But even as the words left her lips, her feet betrayed her, carrying her closer to the shivering bundle of fur. The puppy looked up at her with amber eyes that seemed far too old for such a young face. Those eyes held a depth that Sarah recognized, the look of someone who had already learned that the world could be cruel, that abandonment was real, that survival meant being strong even when you felt broken. Inside, Sarah knelt down slowly, extending her hand, palm up in a gesture of peace. The puppy sniffed tentatively, then pressed his cold wet nose against her fingers. That simple touch broke something loose in her chest, a wall she'd built up over the past 3 years, since returning home from the war. What's your story, little guy? She whispered, her voice softer than it had been in months. The puppy's tail gave the faintest wag, and pop! Sarah made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She scooped him up, feeling his tiny body shaking against her chest. He was lighter than he should have been, clearly malnourished and weak from exposure. All right, boy, looks like you're coming home with me. The drive to her cabin took 20 minutes through winding mountain roads, and Sarah found herself talking to the puppy the entire way. You know, I wasn't planning on getting a dog. Hell, I wasn't planning on getting attached to anything ever again. The puppy had stopped shivering in the warmth of her truck, instead curling up on the passenger seat and watching her with those intelligent eyes. But maybe we both need this, huh? Sarah's cabin sat on the edge of Mirror Lake, a modest 2-bedroom structure she'd bought with her military savings. It was isolated, peaceful, and exactly what she'd needed when the nightmares and flashbacks had become too much to handle in the crowded city. The wooden porch creaked under her boots as she carried the puppy inside, flicking on lights that revealed a simple but comfortable home filled with military memorabilia and the kind of Spartan organization that never quite left a soldier. Welcome to your new home, Sarah said, setting the puppy down on a thick rug near the fireplace. First things first, you need food, a bath, and a name. She rummaged through her kitchen cabinets until she found a can of chicken soup, warming some of the broth in a shallow bowl. The puppy attacked it with desperate hunger, confirming Sarah's suspicions about his neglected state. While he ate, she prepared a warm bath in her utility sink, gathering old towels and testing the water temperature with the same precision she'd once used to field strip her rifles. Boy, she murmured as she lowered him into the water. The puppy tensed, but didn't struggle, seeming to understand that she meant no harm. As the dirt and grime washed away, his coat revealed itself to be a rich combination of black and tan, classic German Shepherd markings that would be striking once he filled out and grew into his oversized paws. As she towel-dried him by the fireplace, Sarah found herself studying his features more carefully. There was something regal about the set of his ears, the way he carried himself despite his youth and ordeal. He reminded her of the military working dogs she'd served alongside, overseas, intelligent, loyal, bred for courage and devotion. Rex, she said suddenly, and the puppy's ears perked up as if he approved. Yeah, you look like a Rex, king of this little mountain kingdom. The first night, Sarah set up a makeshift bed for Rex near the fireplace, but she woke at 0300 hours to find him curled up on the rug beside her bed, watching over her sleep. It was the first full night's rest she'd had in months. No nightmares, no cold sweats, just the peaceful breathing of a dog who'd already appointed himself her guardian. The next morning brought the beginning of their routine. Sarah had always been an early riser, a habit ingrained by years of military discipline, but now she had a purpose beyond simply filling the empty hours. Rex needed structure training, and most importantly, he needed to learn that he was safe, that he belonged somewhere. All right, recruit, Sarah said, clipping a makeshift leash to Rex's new collar time for morning PT. She'd bought supplies in town the day before. Proper dog food, toys, a real leash and collar, and a book on German Shepherd training that she'd studied with the same intensity she'd once applied to tactical manuals there. Morning runs started simple, just a walk around the lake while Rex learned to heel properly. But Sarah could see the potential in his gait, the way he naturally wanted to match her pace, the intelligence in how quickly he learned commands. Within a week, he was trotting beside her without the leash, staying perfectly at her left side as they covered increasingly longer distances around the mountain trails. Good boy, Rex. Steady pace, eyes forward. The familiar cadence of giving commands felt natural, comfortable in a way that civilian life had not. Rex seemed to thrive on the structure too, his confidence growing daily as he mastered each new skill. Evenings were for more focused training. Sarah had converted part of her back deck into an obstacle course. Nothing fancy, just some wooden planks for balance, beams of tire to jump through, and various objects for Rex to learn to navigate around. She taught him the basics. Sit, stay, come down, but also more advanced commands that came from her experience with military working dogs. Rex, watch me, she'd say, holding a treat above her head, until his amber eyes locked onto hers with laser focus. Good, now track. She'd hide the treat somewhere in the yard and watch with pride as Rex used his nose to locate it, his natural hunting instincts sharp despite his young age. But it was the quiet moments that truly forged their bond. Late at night, when the mountain silence pressed in and Sarah's memories threatened to overwhelm her, Rex would sense her distress and come to sit beside her chair, his warm presence a steadying force against the chaos in her mind. He didn't judge her for the times she woke up screaming, didn't flinch when she paced the cabin at 2 a.m. because sleep wouldn't come. He simply stayed close, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone anymore. You know what your problem is, Rex? Sarah said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint Mirror Lake in shades of gold and crimson. Rex tilted his head in that characteristic way that made it seem like he was actually listening. You're too good at your job, making me forget what it was like before you showed up. Rex's tail thumped against the wooden decking, and he leaned against her leg with the full weight of his growing body. At 4 months old, he was already showing signs of the powerful dog he would become. Broader shoulders, longer legs, and a confidence that came from knowing he was exactly where he belonged. Sarah scratched behind his ears, marveling at how quickly this abandoned puppy had become the center of her world. For the first time since coming home from the war, she felt like herself again. Not the broken veteran who jumped at unexpected sounds, not the woman who couldn't hold down a job because crowds made her panic, but Sarah Martinez, protector, trainer, and the human half of a team that was growing stronger every day. But as autumn gave way to winter and their bond deepened, Sarah began to notice things that made her uneasy. Sometimes late at night, Rex would go rigid at the window, his ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbling in his chest. When she looked outside, she saw nothing but darkness and the familiar shapes of pine trees swaying in the wind, yet Rex's instincts were already too well developed to ignore, and Sarah found herself checking the locks more carefully, keeping her service pistol closer at hand. Then there was the letter that arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she opened it, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possibilities. Recall to active duty news about friends still serving overseas, or some bureaucratic issue with her benefits. But the contents were far more mysterious and troubling than anything she'd imagined. The letter was brief, formal, and unsigned, except for a stamped signature. She didn't recognize it. Asked about any unusual animal acquisitions in her area, particularly dogs with specialized potential for government service. It requested that she report any such animals to a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code, and it ended with a reminder about the ongoing importance of national security cooperation from all citizens, particularly veterans with relevant experience. Sarah read the letter 3 times each reading, making her more unsettled. She looked at Rex, who was lying by the fireplace working on a rope toy she'd bought him, his powerful jaws making short work of the thick fibers. There was nothing unusual about finding an abandoned puppy. It happened all the time, but as she watched Rex demonstrate the intelligence and natural ability that had impressed her from day one, Sarah began to wonder if his abandonment had been quite as random as she'd assumed. What do you think, Rex? She asked, holding up the letter. Should I be worried about this? Rex looked up at her with those amber eyes that seemed to hold far too much wisdom for a 6-month-old puppy, and for the first time since she'd found him, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter pressing against her windows. Whatever forces had brought Rex into her life, she had a growing suspicion that they weren't finished with either of them yet. Snow began to fall outside, covering the lake and surrounding mountains in a blanket of pristine white. Sarah made a decision that would define everything that followed. She walked to her kitchen drawer, pulled out the letter, and fed it to the flames in her fireplace. Whatever the government wanted, whatever Rex's mysterious past might hold, she wasn't going to be the one to hand him over. Our mine, now, she whispered to Rex as the letter curled and blackened in the fire. And I protect what's mine. Rex's tail thumped once against the floor, and he returned to his toy with renewed vigor, as if he understood and approved of her choice. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, and Sarah could have sworn she heard the distant sound of a vehicle on the usually empty mountain road. But when she looked out the window, she saw nothing but snow and shadows, and she told herself it was just the mountain playing tricks with sound and wind. Still, that night she double-checked all the locks and made sure her pistol was loaded and within easy reach, because Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 2 tours of combat and the long war of coming home afterward to be naive about the fact that sometimes the most dangerous battles were the ones you never saw coming. Winter settled over Mirror Lake like a familiar blanket, transforming Sarah's world into something both beautiful and isolating. The snow piled high against the cabin's windows, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety that felt like the closest thing to peace. Sarah had experienced since returning from overseas. Rex thrived in the cold, his thick coat perfectly suited for the Montana climate and their daily routines. Adapted to accommodate the harsh weather, morning runs became snowshoe expeditions along frozen trails, with Rex bounding through drifts that sometimes reached his shoulders. His energy seemed boundless, and Sarah marveled at how quickly he'd grown at 8 months old. Rex had filled out into a magnificent specimen of his breed. 70 pounds of muscle and intelligence, with alert ears and a noble bearing that turned heads whenever they ventured into town for supplies. Easy Rex, Sarah called as he plowed through a particularly deep snowbank, sending up a spray of white powder that caught the morning sunlight like diamonds. Save some energy for training their afternoon sessions had evolved far beyond basic obedience. Rex had mastered complex commands that would have impressed military trainers, and his natural abilities continued to astound Sarah daily. He could track scents through snow, identify different types of threats through subtle changes in body language, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense Sarah's emotional state before she was even aware of it herself. Rex, search, Sarah commanded, hiding a training dummy somewhere in the tree line around their property. Rex's nose went to work immediately, methodically quartering the area until he located the target and sat beside it, waiting for his reward. The precision of his work reminded Sarah of the best military working dogs she'd served alongside, and sometimes she caught herself wondering what kind of breeding had produced such exceptional natural ability. But it was during the quiet evening hours that their bond truly deepened. Rex had claimed his spot on the rug beside Sarah's reading chair, and he seemed to have an innate understanding of when she needed company and when she needed space. On the nights when memories of combat pressed too close, when the sound of wind through the trees reminded her too much of distant gunfire, Rex would quietly move closer, resting his head on her foot or pressing his warm body against her legs until the flashbacks subsided her. Getting too smart for your own good, Sarah told him one evening, as he correctly anticipated her nighttime routine, moving to the kitchen to wait by his food bowl without being asked. Sometimes I think you understand every word. Rex tilted his head in that characteristic way, and Sarah could have sworn she saw amusement in his amber eyes. Over the months, she'd developed an almost telepathic connection with him, able to read his moods and intentions as clearly as if he could speak when he was alert to potential threats, when he was simply playing, when he sensed something in the environment that required her attention. Sarah had learned to trust his instincts completely. It was on a particularly quiet Tuesday evening in February that those instincts first truly alarmed her. Rex had been contentedly chewing a bone by the fireplace when he suddenly went rigid, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with alertness. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, so quiet, Sarah almost missed it. What is it, boy? She asked, setting down her book and following his gaze toward the front windows outside. The world was still and white under the light of a full moon, the lake frozen solid and surrounded by heavy pines. Nothing seemed out of place, but Rex's reaction was too pronounced to ignore. Sarah moved to the window, staying to one side as she'd been trained, and scanned the visible area around her property. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then, just at the edge of her vision, she caught a brief glint of reflection from the tree line there, and gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but Rex's continued vigilance told her otherwise. Good boy, she whispered, reaching for the binoculars she kept on the windowsill. Through the lenses she could make out the shapes of trees and rocks, but nothing that clearly explained Rex's alert behavior. Still, Sarah had learned to trust the instincts that had kept her alive in far more dangerous places than rural Montana. She spent the next hour conducting what she mentally termed a perimeter check, moving from window to window with Rex at her side, both of them scanning for any sign of intrusion or surveillance. When they found nothing conclusive, Sarah finally called Rex back to the fireplace, but she kept her sidearm close at hand and found herself listening more carefully to every sound the old cabin made. As it settled in the cold, the next morning brought fresh snow that would have covered any tracks. But Sarah made it a point to walk the entire perimeter of her property. With Rex's behavior was normal, interested in scents and sounds, but without the hypervigilance of the night before. Still, Sarah made note of sightlines from the tree line to her cabin, mentally cataloging positions that would offer the best vantage points for someone who might want to observe her property undetected. Am I getting paranoid, Rex? She asked as they completed their circuit, or are we right to be careful? Rex's response was to press closer to her side, and Sarah took that as validation of her caution. Military training didn't simply disappear because you'd traded fatigues for civilian clothes, and the letter she'd burned weeks earlier had planted seeds of unease that continued to grow. Those seeds sprouted into something larger the following week, when Sarah spotted a dark blue pickup truck parked at the end of her access road. During their morning run, the vehicle was too far away to make out details, but it was positioned with a clear view of anyone coming or going from her property. When Sarah and Rex approached, the truck's engine started, and it pulled away before they could get close enough to see the license plate or driver. Coincidence? Sarah asked Rex as they watched the truck disappear around a bend in the main road. Rex's ears remained pricked forward, tracking sounds she couldn't hear, and his body language suggested continued alertness rather than the relaxed posture of a dog who'd dismissed a potential threat. The truck appeared twice more over the next week, always at a distance, always leaving when Sarah tried to approach. She began varying her routines, taking different routes for their runs and changing the times of their activities, but the surveillance, that's what it was, seemed to adapt accordingly. Rex's behavior confirmed her suspicions. He'd developed a distinctive alert posture whenever the truck was in the vicinity, even when Sarah hadn't yet spotted it herself. "We're being watched, aren't we, boy?" Sarah said one evening as they stood on the deck, both of them scanning the tree line that surrounded their property. "Question is by who and why?" The answer came on a gray Thursday afternoon in early March when Rex's barking drew Sarah's attention to a black SUV pulling into her driveway. The vehicle had government plates and the kind of understated, official appearance that immediately put Sarah's military instincts on high alert. She watched from her window as two people emerged, a man in a dark suit who looked like he'd been issued from a federal agency catalog, and a woman in military uniform whose bearing suggested career officer. Sarah took a moment to secure her sidearm in its holster before opening the door, keeping Rex at her side with a subtle hand signal. The dog's posture was alert but controlled, ready to respond to whatever command she might give Ms. Martinez. The man said, approaching with the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. "I'm Agent Collins, from the Department of Homeland Security, and this is Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, from the Army's Military Working Dog Program. We'd like to speak with you about a matter of national security." Sarah's training kicked in, automatically assess the threat, control the conversation, never volunteer information. "I assume you have identification," she said calmly, noting how both visitors' eyes kept tracking to Rex, who stood perfectly still at her side. After examining their credentials, Sarah reluctantly invited them inside, though she positioned herself so that she maintained clear sightlines to both visitors and quick access to her weapon if necessary. Rex seemed to sense the tension and moved to a position where he could watch both strangers simultaneously. "Beautiful dog," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, her tone professional but with an undertone that made Sarah's skin crawl. "German Shepherd, looks like excellent breeding. Where did you acquire him?" "I found him abandoned," Sarah replied carefully. "Is there some problem with pet ownership that I'm not aware of?" Agent Collins consulted a tablet computer. Scrolling through information, Sarah couldn't see. "Ms. Martinez, we have reason to believe that the animal in your possession may have significant value to ongoing national security operations. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for his voluntary transfer to government custody." Sarah felt Rex tinsel slightly beside her, as if he could understand the conversation and its implications. "Rex isn't for sale," she said firmly. "He's not property. His family." "I understand your attachment," Lieutenant Colonel Hayes said, "but you need to understand that some animals are bred specifically for military and security applications. If this dog has been stolen from a government breeding program or represents unauthorized possession of military assets, we have legal authority to reclaim him. Then you'll need to provide proof of ownership and proper legal documentation." Sarah replied, her voice taking on the steel edge that had once commanded respect in combat zones. "Until then, Rex stays with me." The two officials exchanged glances, and Agent Collins leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Martinez, your military record shows exemplary service and a strong commitment to national security. We're hoping to resolve this as colleagues rather than adversaries. The compensation we're offering is quite generous, enough to purchase a comfortable home anywhere you'd like, plus ongoing support." Payment. Sarah looked down at Rex, who was watching the strangers with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should. In that moment, she realized that whatever forces had brought Rex into her life were far more complex and dangerous than she'd imagined. But she also realized that it didn't matter. Rex had saved her in ways these people could never understand, and she would not abandon him to whatever fate they had planned. "The answer is no," Sarah said, with finality. "Rex stays with me." Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' expression hardened. "Ms. Martinez, I hope you'll reconsider. Sometimes cooperation is in everyone's best interest." After the officials left, Sarah double-checked all her security measures and made plans to vary their routines even more dramatically. Rex seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed, staying closer to her side and displaying heightened alertness whenever they left the property. That night, as they sat by the fireplace, Sarah stroked Rex's head and made a promise that she intended to keep, regardless of the consequences. "Whatever they want you for, whatever you were bred for, it doesn't matter," she whispered. "You're mine now, and I don't abandon my own." Rex's amber eyes met hers with an intensity that seemed almost human, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that he understood not just her words but the full weight of the choice she was making. Outside, the Montana wind howled through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of storms ahead, both meteorological and human. But inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, a woman and her dog prepared to face whatever challenges would come, bound together by loyalty that ran deeper than blood and stronger than any threat the outside world might bring to their door. Spring arrived late that year, with snow lingering well into April and the lake remaining frozen longer than Sarah could remember, but Rex's clues seemed to sense the changing season before any visible signs appeared, his energy increasing and his alertness sharpening. As if he knew that winter's protective isolation was coming to an end, Sarah found herself matching his heightened vigilance, both of them unconsciously, preparing for whatever would come with the thaw. The surveillance had continued throughout the winter, sometimes obvious and sometimes so subtle that only Rex's reactions confirmed Sarah's suspicions. The dark truck, the mysterious SUV figures glimpsed briefly at the tree line before vanishing, all had become part of their new normal. Sarah had documented what she could, varying their routines and maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings, but she knew they were living on borrowed time. We should probably think about relocating, she told Rex. One morning, as they completed their perimeter check at a year old, he had reached his full size and magnificent maturity, 85 pounds of perfectly proportioned German Shepherd, with intelligence that continued to astound her daily. Maybe head somewhere with more people around, harder for them to operate freely. But Rex's response was to move closer to her side, his amber eyes scanning the familiar landscape of their mountain home with what Sarah could only interpret as possessive determination. This was his territory now, the place where he'd grown from terrified puppy to confident guardian, and he wasn't ready to abandon it any more than she was. The first direct escalation came on a Tuesday evening in late April. Sarah had driven into town for supplies, leaving Rex at home, as she sometimes did when the errands would take several hours. The feed store, grocery shopping, and a stop at the hardware store had stretched longer than expected, and darkness was falling by the time she turned onto the mountain road toward home. Her first indication that something was wrong came when her headlights swept across the access road and revealed tire tracks in the mud. Fresh tracks that were too wide to be from her own truck. Sarah immediately killed her lights and pulled over, using muscle memory from combat deployments to assess the tactical situation. If someone had come to her property while she was away, Rex would have defended it. The question was whether he'd been able to do so successfully. Sarah approached her cabin on foot, moving through the forest with skills she'd hoped never to use again in civilian life. The moon was dark, but her night vision adapted quickly, and she could make out the familiar shapes of her property as she closed the distance. Everything appeared normal from the outside: no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no unusual vehicles in sight. But when she whistled the soft, distinctive call that always brought Rex running, she was met with silence. Rex, she called louder, this time her voice carrying the note of command that never failed to bring an immediate response. Still nothing. Sarah felt ice forming in her chest, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She circled the cabin methodically, checking every window and door, looking for signs of struggle or forced entry. The back door was standing slightly ajar, something she never would have left that way, and something Rex would never have allowed to remain open. Inside, furniture had been moved slightly, subtle signs that someone had conducted a thorough search of her home. But it was the discovery in Rex's favorite spot by the fireplace that confirmed her worst fears. His collar lay on the rug, the heavy leather cut cleanly through, as if removed by someone who knew what they were doing. Beside it was a single dart, the kind used for animal tranquilizers, and a small device that Sarah recognized as a tracking chip removal tool. Sarah sank to her knees beside the collar, her hands shaking as the full weight of the situation hit her. They had taken Rex while she'd been buying groceries and chatting with the hardware store clerk about spring planting. Professional operatives had invaded her home and stolen the most important thing in her world. The rage that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced, even in combat. This wasn't the heat of battle or the adrenaline of survival. This was the cold, consuming fury of someone who had lost family to deliberate cruelty. She spent the next hour systematically searching every inch of her property, looking for additional clues. But whoever had taken Rex had been thorough and professional. At midnight, she called the county sheriff's office, though she held little hope for official assistance. Deputy Morrison arrived an hour later, a good man who'd known Sarah since she'd moved to the area, but his expression was sympathetic rather than optimistic. File a report, Sarah, but you know how these things go with stolen dogs, he said, examining the cut collar and dart, especially valuable ones like Rex. They could be anywhere by now, illegal fighting rings, private collectors, even out of state or country. This wasn't random theft, Sarah said, showing him the precision of the collar cut and the professional grade of the dart. This was a targeted operation by people who knew exactly what they were doing. Deputy Morrison nodded grimly. I'll put out alerts to all the neighboring counties and contact the FBI about interstate animal trafficking. But he didn't finish the sentence. But Sarah understood the chances of recovering Rex through official channels were virtually not existent. After the deputy left, Sarah began her own investigation with the systematic thoroughness that had made her an effective soldier. She printed hundreds of flyers with Rex's photo and description, posting them at every veterinary clinic, animal shelter, and business within a 300-mile radius. She created online postings on every missing pet website and social media platform she could find. She contacted private investigators who specialized in animal recovery, though most told her that cases involving professional theft had very low success rates. Days turned into weeks and weeks stretched into months. Sarah's savings account drained as she pursued every lead traveled to investigate every possible sighting and followed up on tips that invariably led nowhere. She drove the back roads of 3 states checking illegal fighting venues and puppy mills, interviewing people who lived in the shadows of the animal trade. The physical search was exhausting, but the emotional toll was devastating. Rex had been more than a pet. He'd been her partner, her anchor, her reason for getting up each morning. Without him the cabin felt cavernously empty, and the silence where his breathing used to provide comfort became a constant reminder of her failure to protect him. Sarah's hair began showing streaks of premature gray and she lost weight. She couldn't afford to lose the military medals and commendations that had once been displayed proudly, gathered dust on their shelves, mocking reminders of a time when she'd been competent, when she'd been able to keep her team safe, when she'd never failed. The ones who counted on her the nightmares returned with a vengeance, but now they featured Rex, as often as her fallen comrades' dreams, where she could hear him barking in distress but couldn't reach him. Visions of him in fighting rings or laboratory cages, wondering if he remembered her or if he thought she'd abandoned him. Sarah would wake up calling his name, her heart pounding and her sheets soaked with sweat, only to face the reality that he was gone. And she didn't know if he was even still alive. Summer passed in a blur of fruitless searching. Autumn arrived with its familiar cold, but without Rex to share the changing seasons. Sarah found no beauty in the landscape that had once been their refuge. She continued to maintain his food and water bowls, unable to accept that he might never need them again. His toys remained scattered around the cabin, exactly where he'd left them, and Sarah couldn't bring herself to put them away. The isolation that had once been healing became oppressive without Rex as her buffer against the world. Sarah found herself withdrawing from human contact, unable to explain to well-meaning neighbors and friends that his disappearance had torn away the foundation of her hard-won stability. The depression that she'd fought off with Rex's help came flooding back, bringing with it the familiar companions of insomnia, hypervigilance, and the crushing weight of failure. By winter, Sarah had exhausted every lead and followed every tip to its disappointing conclusion. The investigation had taken her to dogfighting rings in urban basements, puppy mills, hidden in rural outbuildings and private estates where wealthy collectors kept exotic animals as status symbols. She'd seen horrors that added new nightmares to her collection, but she'd never found any trace of Rex. The cabin that had once been filled with the sounds of their shared life, Rex's breathing, the click of his nails on hardwood floors, the thump of his tail against furniture, now echoed with Sarah's solitary footsteps. She'd developed the habit of talking to him as if he could hear her, updating him on her search efforts and promising that she would never stop looking, never stop hoping that somehow he would find his way home. "I know you're out there somewhere," she said, one snowy evening, standing on the deck where they'd once watched sunsets together. "I know you remember this place, remember me. I just need to figure out where they took you." Wind carried her words away into the darkness, and Sarah wondered if Rex was somewhere looking up at the same stars, wondering why she hadn't come to rescue him yet. The thought that he might feel abandoned, might think she'd given up on him, was more painful than any physical wound she'd ever sustained. 3 years passed in this routine of hope and heartbreak. Sarah aged beyond her years, her face etched with the kind of lines that came from constant worry and interrupted sleep. She'd turned her cabin into a command center for the search, with maps marking every location she'd investigated, databases of animal recovery organizations, and files full of tips and leads that had all led nowhere. Friends and family had long since stopped calling to check on her progress, unable to understand her unwillingness to move on and get another dog. But Sarah knew what they couldn't, that Rex wasn't just another dog, and she wasn't just another pet owner. They'd been a team bound together by loyalty and understanding that transcended the typical human-animal relationship. Replacing him would have been like replacing a part of her soul. On quiet nights when the pain of his absence threatened to overwhelm her completely, Sarah would sit in his favorite spot by the fireplace and remember the good times, their morning runs around the lake, the evening training sessions, the way he'd press against her legs when the nightmares came. She held on to those memories like lifelines, proof that their bond had been real and worth the agony of losing it. But as the 4th winter of his absence began to settle over Mirror Lake, Sarah found herself facing a truth she'd been avoiding. The search had become her entire existence, a mission that had consumed her life as surely as the war had once consumed her youth. She was no closer to finding Rex than she'd been the night he was taken, and the professional thieves who'd stolen him had vanished without leaving any trail she could follow. Still, every morning she woke up with the same thought that had driven her for 3 years. Today might be the day. Today might bring the lead that would bring Rex home. Because the alternative, accepting that he was truly gone forever, remained unthinkable. Sarah Martinez had survived combat trauma and the long journey back to civilian life, but losing Rex had broken something in her that she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. All she could do was keep searching, keep hoping, and keep faith that somehow, someday, their story would have a different ending than this endless winter of loss and longing. The November morning dawned gray and cold, with the kind of bitter wind that cut through even Sarah's warmest jacket, and settled, deep in her bones, she sat in her wheelchair at the corner of Main Street and Fifth Avenue, positioned where the parade route would give her the best view of the veterans. The day procession, it had taken her 3 hours to work up the courage to leave the cabin, and she was already regretting the decision. 5 years. 5 years since Rex had been stolen from her home, and Sarah felt every one of those days like a weight pressing down on her chest. The wheelchair was a recent addition to her life, a result of the accident 6 months ago, when exhaustion and distraction had caused her to miss a curve on the mountain road. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive, but Sarah didn't feel lucky. She felt broken in ways that had nothing to do with shattered bones and damaged nerves. You should get out more. Her physical therapist had said isolation isn't helping your recovery. The Veterans Day Parade would be a good start to connect with your community. Remember what service means. Sarah had wanted to tell her that she remembered service just fine. It was everything else that seemed to slip away like water through her fingers, but she'd nodded and made the promise more to end the conversation than out of any real desire to rejoin the world that had taken Rex from her, now surrounded by families. With children clutching small American flags and veterans wearing their old unit patches, Sarah felt more isolated than ever. The conversations around her blended into background noise, stories of deployments and homecomings, complaints about benefits, and healthcare discussions of who would be marching, with which unit. She'd stopped being part of that world years ago when her search for Rex had consumed everything else. The parade began with the local high school marching band there, music crisp in the cold air and their uniforms bright against the overcast sky. Sarah watched with detached interest as color guards passed by, followed by classic military vehicles and veterans from wars spanning 7 decades. She recognized some faces from her own deployment, men and women who'd managed to build lives after coming home, who'd found purpose beyond the service that had once defined them. Then came the military working dog demonstration. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw them approaching. 6 German Shepherds and Belgian Malinois in perfect formation, their handlers in dress uniforms, walking with the precise cadence that spoke of countless hours of training. The dogs were magnificent specimens, alert and focused, their coats gleaming in the pale sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. The crowd around her stirred with appreciation, children pointing excitedly at the impressive animals, adults murmuring comments about their obvious training and discipline. Sarah found herself leaning forward in her wheelchair, her heart rate increasing for the first time in months as she watched the demonstration approach. Ladies and gentlemen, announced the parade marshal over his portable speaker system, please welcome the Mountain States Military Working Dog Unit, demonstrating the incredible bond between handler and canine that serves our nation's security forces around the world. The dogs moved with the fluid precision that Sarah remembered from her deployments, each animal perfectly attuned to their handler's commands and environmental cues. Their bearing spoke of confidence, intelligence, and the kind of training that only came from intensive work with experienced professionals. Sarah watched with the eye of someone who understood what she was seeing, appreciating the subtle communications between human and animal that made such performances possible. And then she saw him. The third dog in the formation was slightly larger than the others, his coat a shade darker with distinctive markings around his face that Sarah would have recognized anywhere. Her hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair so tightly that her knuckles went white, and she felt the world narrow to a single point of focus. Rex, it was impossible. 5 years of searching, thousands of miles traveled, hundreds of leads followed to disappointing conclusions. But Sarah knew those amber eyes, that particular set to his ears, the way he carried himself with unconscious nobility. The dog walking past her in perfect military formation was older, more muscled, bearing the confidence that came from years of professional training, but it was unmistakably Rex. Rex, she whispered, the word barely audible, even to herself. Dog's ears twitched slightly, and for just a moment, his head turned toward her voice. But his handler, young sergeant with the bearing of someone who took his responsibilities seriously, corrected the movement with a subtle command, and the dog resumed his forward focus. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the formation continue past her position. Every instinct screamed at her to call out, to wheel her chair into the street, to do something to get Rex's attention. But the crowd pressed around her, and the parade continued its orderly progression, carrying Rex further away with each step. Rex, she called louder this time, her voice carrying over the ambient noise of the crowd. Several people turned to look at her, and she caught a glimpse of Rex's ears pricking forward again. But the handler maintained his control, and the formation continued without breaking stride. The crowd around Sarah began to murmur, some with amusement at what they assumed was someone mistaking a military dog for a lost pet, others with mild annoyance at the disruption. Mom, that's a working military dog, said an older gentleman beside her, his tone kindly condescending. I know all German Shepherds can look similar, but those animals are highly trained government properties. Sarah barely heard him. Her entire world had contracted to the sight of Rex, moving away from her, surrounded by people who saw him as equipment rather than the living being who'd shared her bed during nightmares, who'd pressed his warm body against her legs when the flashbacks came, who'd been stolen from the life they'd built together. The formation was nearly at the end of the block now, but Sarah could see Rex's body language changing. His head kept turning slightly toward where she sat, and his gait had lost some of its mechanical precision even after 5 years of military conditioning. Some part of him remembered her voice, responded to the sound of his name spoken by the person who'd found him shivering in the rain and given him a home. Rex. Sarah shouted with all the command authority she'd once used to control soldiers in combat situations. This time the response was unmistakable. Rex stopped mid-stride, his entire body going rigid as his head swiveled toward her voice. The handler tried to correct him, but Rex had shifted into full alert mode, scanning the crowd with the intensity of a dog who'd heard something that bypassed years of training and went straight to his core memories. The crowd around Sarah had gone quiet, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand what. Rex's handler was speaking to him in low, urgent tones, trying to regain control of the situation, but Rex had found her in the crowd. Their eyes met across 20 feet of parade route and 5 years of separation, and Sarah saw recognition flare in those amber depths, like a flame being rekindled for a moment that felt like eternity. They simply stared at each other, the broken woman in the wheelchair and the magnificent dog who'd been transformed into a military asset. Sarah could see the conflict in Rex's posture, the tension between his training and his memory, between duty and the bond that had once defined his entire world. Then the handler's commands reasserted themselves, and Rex was pulled back into formation. But as the military working dog unit continued down the parade route, Rex kept looking back, his head turning repeatedly toward where Sarah sat among the crowd. And Sarah understood with crystalline clarity that whatever they had done to him, however they had trained him, Rex remembered. Rex knew who she was. The rest of the parade passed in a blur. Sarah sat frozen in her wheelchair, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just witnessed. Rex was alive. Rex was here in her own town, being displayed as part of a military demonstration. After 5 years of wondering if he was dead, of imagining him in fighting rings or laboratory cages, he was not only alive, but clearly healthy and magnificently trained. But he was also completely beyond her reach, surrounded by military personnel and classified as government property. The realization that she'd finally found him, only to discover he was more lost to her than ever, threatened to shatter what remained of her emotional stability. As the last unit passed by and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah remained in her chair, staring down the empty street where Rex had disappeared around the corner. Families packed up their folding chairs and children dropped their small flags in the gutters. But Sarah couldn't move. She'd spent 5 years searching for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she had no idea what to do with it too. "Okay, honey?" asked an elderly woman who'd been sitting nearby. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah turned to face her, and the woman stepped back slightly at whatever she saw in Sarah's expression. "Not a ghost," Sarah said quietly. "Something much more complicated than that." As the sun set over the parade route and the last spectators headed home to their Sunday dinners and family gatherings, Sarah Martinez sat alone in her wheelchair, staring at the empty street and planning what she knew would be the most important battle of her life. She'd found Rex. Now she had to figure out how to bring him home. The military working dog unit would be staying somewhere local for the night. That much was certain. Transportation logistics alone meant they wouldn't be traveling immediately after the parade. Sarah had, until morning, maybe less, to formulate a plan that could somehow bridge 5 years of separation and the vast gulf between civilian desperation and military authority. But as she finally began to wheel herself toward her adapted van, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not the desperate, painful hope that had sustained her through countless false leads and disappointing dead ends, but the solid, realistic hope of someone who'd finally found their target and was preparing to take action. Rex was alive. Rex remembered her and Sarah Martinez, who had never met a bureaucracy or authority structure she couldn't find a way around when the mission was important enough. This mission was the most important of her life. Sarah spent the night parked outside the National Guard Armory, her van positioned where she could monitor all vehicle traffic while remaining inconspicuous among the other civilian cars scattered around the area. She'd made discreet inquiries at 2 local hotels and confirmed that the military working dog unit was indeed staying overnight before continuing to their next demonstration in Billings. The knowledge that Rex was sleeping somewhere within a 5-mile radius of her position was both comforting and torturous. By dawn, Sarah had formulated what she hoped was a workable plan. It relied on timing her military credentials and the assumption that Rex's response to her voice hadn't gone unnoticed by his handlers. If she was wrong about any of these factors, she risked not only failure, but potentially criminal charges for interfering with military operations. At 630 hours, Sarah positioned herself near the armory's main entrance, her wheelchair giving her the appearance of someone who belonged in the area rather than a threat to be assessed and neutralized. She'd dressed in her old BDUs with her combat patches visible, presenting herself as a fellow veteran rather than a desperate civilian. Her service pistol was locked in the van. She couldn't afford to appear threatening, and success would depend on communication rather than confrontation. The military working dog unit emerged from the armory at 0715. The handlers, moving with the efficient precision of soldiers who'd done this routine countless times before. Sarah counted 6 dogs, but her attention focused immediately on Rex, who was walking in his designated position with the mechanical perfection she'd witnessed during the parade. But as the unit moved toward their transport vehicles, Rex's head began turning, scanning the area with the systematic methodology of a trained security dog. When his gaze swept across Sarah's position, he froze midst, his entire body going rigid with recognition contact. Sarah whispered to herself, using the old military terminology that came naturally in moments of high stress. Rex's handler, the same young sergeant from the parade, immediately noticed the change in his dog's behavior. Kaiser heel, he commanded, using what Sarah realized was Rex's military designation. The name hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to focus on the mission. Sergeant, Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I need to speak with your unit commander about one of your animals. The sergeant looked up, taking in Sarah's military bearing and visible combat patches. His expression shifted from mild irritation to professional. Attention, ma'am, if you have concerns about our demonstration yesterday, I can direct you to the appropriate. That dog, Sarah interrupted, pointing directly at Rex, who was now straining slightly against his leash and whining low in his throat. What's his history before military acquisition? The sergeant's eyes narrowed, and Sarah could see him processing the implications of her question. Rex's behavior was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The perfectly trained military working dog was acting like he recognized someone in the crowd, which shouldn't have been possible given his supposedly controlled background. Mom, I'm going to need you to speak with Lieutenant Morrison, the sergeant said, gesturing toward a woman in officer's uniform who was supervising the loading of equipment. She's our unit commander. Sarah wheeled her chair toward the lieutenant. Rex's agitation increased. The low whining became more audible, and his body language shifted into the alert posture. Sarah remembered from their days together, ears forward, muscles tense, eyes locked onto her with laser intensity. Lieutenant Morrison, Sarah said, extending her hand in the military greeting that had once been second nature. Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, retired. I need to discuss one of your animals with you. Lieutenant Morrison shook her hand with the firm grip of someone who understood rank and respect, but her expression was cautious. What's your concern, Staff Sergeant? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would determine whether this conversation ended in success or disaster. That German Shepherd, the one your sergeant called Kaiser, I believe he was stolen from my property 5 years ago. His name is Rex, and he was taken during a break-in at my home in Montana. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose, and Sarah could see her processing the claim with the analytical mind of an experienced officer. Staff Sergeant, that's a serious accusation. Kaiser has been with our unit for years, acquired through proper military breeding program channels. Then you should be able to provide documentation of his breeding medical history and acquisition, Sarah said, her tone remaining professional despite the emotional storm raging inside her. Because I can provide veterinary records, photographs, and witness testimony dating back to when I found him as an abandoned puppy. Rex's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. The low whining had escalated to barely suppressed barks, and he was pulling against his leash with increasing urgency. Other members of the unit had stopped their preparations to watch the interaction, recognizing that something significant was happening, even if they didn't understand what Sergeant Williams. Lieutenant Morrison called to Rex's handler, bring Kaiser over here. As the sergeant approached with Rex, Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment she'd dreamed about and dreaded for 5 years, the chance to be reunited with Rex, but under circumstances that might make that reunion impossible. Rex's response to being brought closer to Sarah was immediate and dramatic. The military precision of his bearing dissolved as he began straining toward her, his tail beginning to wag. Despite years of training that should have suppressed such displays of emotion, the sound he was making shifted from whining to something that could only be described as crying, the vocalization of an animal in emotional distress. Kaiser, sit, stay, Sergeant Williams commanded, but Rex's attention was entirely focused on Sarah. The dog's body language was unmistakable to anyone who understood canine behavior. He was desperate to reach her, fighting against his training and his leash with increasing urgency. Staff Sergeant Martinez, Lieutenant Morrison said carefully, if this animal truly is your missing dog, you should be able to demonstrate some kind of specific connection that couldn't be faked or coincidental. Sarah looked at Rex, who was now sitting but trembling with the effort of containing himself. 5 years of separation, 5 years of wondering if he remembered her, 5 years of hoping for exactly this moment. She took a deep breath and spoke the command that had once been their evening. Ritual, Rex, she said quietly, her voice carrying across the space between them with perfect clarity. Homeboy, come home. What happened next would be talked about for years by everyone who witnessed it. Rex's military training for years of conditioning, discipline, and controlled behavior shattered like glass with a sound that was part bark, part howl, and entirely heartbroken he lunged forward with such force that Sergeant Williams lost his grip on the leash. Rex covered the 20 feet between them in 3 bounds, launching himself at Sarah's wheelchair with the kind of desperate joy that transcended species barriers. His front paws landed on her lap as he pressed his face against her neck, the whimpering sounds he was making shifting to something that sounded almost like wrapped her arms around Rex's neck, feeling the familiar weight and warmth of him against her body for the first time in 5 years. Her own tears came, then months of suppressed grief and hope pouring out as she buried her face in his fur and whispered the words she'd dreamed of saying, "I found you, I never stopped looking. I never gave up." Rex's response was to press closer, his entire body trembling as he tried to occupy the same space as Sarah, as if he could somehow make up for 5 years of separation. Through sheer physical contact, the sounds he was making were unlike anything the military handlers had ever heard from him. Not the controlled vocalizations of a trained working dog, but the emotional release of an animal who'd been reunited with his family. The scene had drawn the attention of everyone in the area. Military personnel, civilian contractors, and early morning passers-by had all stopped to watch the reunion unfolding before them. The silence was profound, the kind of quiet that falls when people witness something that transcends ordinary experience. Lieutenant Morrison was the first to speak, her voice carefully controlled, but not unsympathetic. "Sergeant Williams, when did Kaiser join our unit?" "4 years ago, ma'am." Williams replied, his own voice subdued as he watched his perfectly trained military working dog behave like a pet who'd found his lost owner. "He came to us through the breeding program acquisition," but he paused, clearly struggling with what he was witnessing. "What's Sergeant? But he never bonded with any handler the way working dogs usually do. We assumed it was just his personality made good for security work, where emotional attachment wasn't desired." But this Williams gestured at Rex, who had settled into Sarah's lap with no intention of moving ever again. "This explains everything." Sarah looked up from where she was stroking Rex's head, her face streaked with tears, but her voice steady. "Lieutenant, I have documentation, veterinary records, photographs, from when he was a puppy, witness statements about his disappearance. I can prove he's mine." Lieutenant Morrison nodded slowly, her military bearings softening slightly as she watched. Rex refused to leave Sarah's side, despite repeated commands from his handler. "Staff Sergeant, I believe you know amount of training could fake what we just witnessed, but you need to understand that this creates a significant problem. Kaiser X is classified as military equipment. There are protocols, procedures, chains of command that govern the disposition of military working dogs. Then we follow those protocols," Sarah said, her hand never stopping its movement over Rex's head. "But he's not leaving with you today, after 5 years, after what you just saw. I won't let him be taken from me again." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Rex himself provided the resolution. When Sergeant Williams approached with a new leash, intending to regain control of the situation, Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. Without leaving Sarah's lap, he growled, not the trained aggression of a military working dog, but the protective warning of a dog defending his family. "Stand down, Sergeant," Lieutenant Morrison ordered. "I think it's clear that forcing the issue won't be productive." As the morning sun climbed higher and the crowd of witnesses grew larger, Lieutenant Morrison made the decision that would change all their lives. "Staff Sergeant Martinez, I'm going to contact my superiors and recommend an immediate review of this situation. Until that review is complete, Kaiser X will remain with you. Sergeant Williams, consider yourself temporarily reassigned to liaison duty." The bureaucratic machinery that followed was complex and time-consuming, involving everything from veterinary DNA testing to congressional inquiries about military animal acquisition procedures. But none of that mattered to Sarah as she wheeled her chair toward her van with Rex walking beside her, his head pressed against her leg and his tail wagging for the first time in years. The crowd that had gathered to watch the parade preparation began to applaud slowly at first, then building to a sustained ovation that followed them across the parking lot. They weren't just applauding a reunion. They were witnessing something that reminded everyone present why loyalty mattered, why some bonds couldn't be broken by time, or distance, or institutional authority. "Home, Rex," Sarah whispered as she opened the van's door. "We're going home." Rex's response was to leap into the van and immediately claim his old spot in the passenger seat, settling down with the deep sigh of a dog who'd finally found his way back to where he belonged. As Sarah started the engine and began the drive toward Mirror Lake, she looked over at Rex and saw not the perfectly trained military working dog he'd become, but the shivering puppy she'd found in the rain. 7 years ago, some stories end with separation and loss. Some bonds are broken by time and circumstance, but sometimes when loyalty runs deep enough and love proves stronger than any force that tries to divide it, lost souls find their way home again. Rex was home, and for the first time in 5 years, Sarah Martinez was whole. Story of Sarah and Rex became local legend, eventually inspiring changes in military working dog acquisition protocols and reunion procedures. Their bond, tested by separation and strengthened by reunion, served as a reminder that some loyalties transcend time, distance, and institutional authority, and that the love between a soldier and her dog can survive anything the world throws at it.